A number of years ago, I published in the journal Diogenes a paper entitled From Modern Roots to Postmodern Rhizomes, in which I tried to explore the transition, the alleged transition from mythology to philosophy. The standard view has always been that in the case of philosophy, the logic of explanation changed from the type of explanation that was offered in mythology. In that paper, however, I tried to argue that despite philosophy's claim to have established a different form and logic of explanation, that in fact there is a thread that never did change from mythology to philosophy. And that is the view that explanation really explains only when it is able to ground that which is being explained in a non-phenomenal, or call it, if you will, divine source. There have been many forms of explanation offered historically, starting with genealogy, and I'll look at that in a minute, through the philosophical offering of definitions such as Plato and Socrates proposed, to claiming that explanation explains only if it offers a causal account of the phenomenon under investigation, to the standard or so-called received view of explanation that was in place pretty much since the scientific revolution through, about the 1960s or 70s, to nowadays other views on explanation that I will look at in more detail in part 2 of this presentation. But what I would like to claim is that at least through 1948, the standard and common pattern of explanation is the underlying assumption that first really means divine. And you see that either in the proofs for the existence of God or even in Aristotelian notions of episteme and deduction, that earlier really refers to phenomena that are closer to the divine and therefore that have a certain ontological claim or preference to that which is subsequent. And that in fact, that temporal regression, that if you trace something back in time, that constitutes a form of explanation because it corresponds to tracing the phenomenon back to its more fundamental ontological foundation. And you see that, for example, in the ages of man, in the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age. Well, the further back you go, the more close to the divine and to the golden you get. I want to look first of all at what occurs in mythology, and that is traditionally labeled as a genealogical mode of explanation. That the way you explain something is by providing its genealogy, or in a sense tracing its history back to its origin. And in that paper in Diogenes, copies of which I have for anyone who's interested at this conference, I looked at 4 distinct views of modes of explanation that appear in mythology. And what I want to claim, of course, we're not as interested in mythology today as we are in science, that there is a certain pattern that repeats even in science today. And the 4 areas in mythology where one can detect this type of explanation is in the authority of the hero, the mythological hero, the legitimacy or authority of a city such as Athens, for example, the view that cosmology just is theogony, and later on the authority of the narrator or the storyteller. I look first at a hero's authority. Very interesting that in the case of the Greeks, a hero's authority is clearly due to its pedigree, or his primarily, her pedigree and genealogy. And in the Iliad, that appears very often when Ajax says that his ancestors were greater because they were closer to the gods. That what mythology does is allow us to reconnect with the past, and it's therefore important to know what your pedigree are, whether you are descended from a god. And it's very curious that even the authority or the lethality of weapons in mythology, for example, Achilles' shield, Polyphemus' stake, all have to do with where they came from. That is also true for a city's legitimacy or authority. In the case of Athens, for example, what makes Athens an important city is that it was founded by Athena, Argos was founded by Hera, Lemnos was founded by Hephaestus, and so on. And that is also true of a leader or a political figure in authority, that the reason why he has the authority that he has is what Malinowski calls the charter myth, and that is that you have here a quasi-divine hero who overthrows a monster, and because you can trace the city to its founder by that person, therefore that city has an importance or an authoritativeness, and one in a sense collapses explanation with justification by saying the reason why what it does is right, or it has authority to do so, is because of this origin or source. So the temporal authority of either a leader or a city derives from its founder's supernatural deeds or to his divine nature. In the case of cosmology, for example, this pattern repeats again. For example, Hesiod says, first chaos came to be, then this, then that, then that. And of course, the parallels with the Judeo-Christian Bible are quite clear as well. It's not until Zeus overthrows his father that he establishes a cosmos, and that its lawfulness clearly is implied as being due to its divine founder, Zeus. If it hadn't been a god, the cosmos could not be lawful, is the implication. And the same story occurs with Prometheus, for example. He is the source of fire and reason and cognition or mind. He is the source of those faculties. Finally, you get in mythology what we call the authority of the narrator, and that is that the reason why this story has meaning or significance is also because of where the storyteller got the story from, and the storyteller got the story from a god, clearly. So again, you trace the origin of where the story comes from in the storyteller's mind, and the fact that it comes from a divine source, that gives the story itself its authority. Now, it is curious that in the case of storytelling in epic mythology, such as Hesiod and Homer primarily, we now know that epic storytellers used to change the story a bit in order to be able to connect with his audience. In a sense, you can consider that the storyteller was aware that we live in a participatory universe, and that the audience needed to be able to identify and therefore participate and, in a sense, recreate this story for the explanation that the epic bard is giving to really be valuable or meaningful or important. That does get lost with the rise of philosophy. It is retained in religion with the view that the reason why the Bible is authoritative is because of its divine source. You get the same with the Quran and so on. That does change, but in a sense, it is that it changes and that it is lost in philosophy is an indication that philosophy loses all awareness or all appreciation of the importance of context. When you look at the transition to philosophy, and Thales, as one of the pre-Socratics, is allegedly the first philosopher, Thales claimed that water is the basic fundamental building block of reality. And what you see is that clearly he does discard the justification of the source of inspiration. He doesn't claim that he acquired this information from a divine authority, but rather that he reasoned it out and used logic to come to the conclusion that water is the fundamental building block of all reality. But what I want to claim, though, is that he is still presenting water as the source, no pun intended, as the source of every other form of being. And therefore, by discovering what the fundamental building block is, in his case, water, but nowadays we are certainly looking for that same fundamental building block in the case of the subatomic particle, he is still claiming that the reason he's giving an explanation is because he's able to trace back the phenomenon that we see here and now to its original ontological ground or source, in this case, water. You have the same thing happening later on with Anaximander, who claims, no, it can't be water. Water is too specific. The origin of and ground and source of all reality must be what he calls the apeiron. And the term means boundless or undifferentiated or has no character or characteristics or properties. So therefore, he says you cannot ask for the origin of the apeiron. The apeiron is eternal, but insofar as the apeiron itself in this new way of thinking about philosophy functions as the first state of matter, then his logic of explanation remains genealogical. He is tracing everything that we see now back to it. So, and you also get something very curious in Anaximander. The fact that this apeiron has no properties is completely undifferentiated. It is a non-actual principle or arche. It is the beginning of a dismissal of the local, the contextual, the apparent, the here and now, that philosophy, I am claiming, will characterize itself by. Certainly, this reaches an apex with Socrates and Plato. In the Symposium, the Platonic dialogue where Socrates asks, what is love? Socrates, who's the last speaker, dismisses earlier speakers by saying that the speakers before him had described the origin of love, where it came from, but had not provided its definition. Earlier speakers before Socrates in the Symposium had talked about love is the oldest of the gods. Love has no parents, it is the parent of everything else, and so on and so forth. But Socrates claims that is not the way to go about giving explanations of things. That the way to give an explanation is not by tracing its genealogy back to its source, but rather by giving a definition. However, it seems to me that he's doing something that, if not identical, has a certain common thread, because a proper definition, according to Socrates and Plato, and in fact philosophers up until Quine, is that definition must show the ground of or the essence of the thing being defined as making contact with, as, quote, partaking in, as sharing in this non-physical Platonic form. So it may be a logical grounding and not a genealogical grounding. So what you have in the notion of definition is the assumption that a true and proper definition is somehow transparent to the real. What that means is that it bypasses, it ignores all the superficial, inessential traits that appear to the senses, and somehow taps into the one eternal, universal, or unchanging ground. And that is what I am calling the myth of the root. The notion that in order to explain natural phenomena, that one must somehow trace that natural apparent thing to something that is not directly available to the senses. And of course, our notion that everything is probably explicable in terms of the workings of subatomic particles, none of which are available to the senses, and even some of them are inferred by their trajectories in these Hadron Collider, for example. That is all the reflection of the notion that the reality of that which is apparent must somehow be derived from something that is neither changing, nor contextual, nor local, nor subjective at all. This is the meaning of a taproot. In biology, carrots are taproots. They are the perfect example of a taproot. It is one root core that goes down, down, down into the earth. And the notion that philosophy and science borrow is that what their task is either to find the one correct method, be it scientific method, or in the case of philosophy, it's ranged from Cartesian innate ideas, or the empiricists' sensory data, or in ethics, the categorical imperative or the principle of utility. And in fact, this appears today in theories of management and business with, oh, well, we found this total quality management technique that if we apply this, it will give us the answer because it is the method that in fact gives us the truth and the most efficient way of dealing with things. It goes back to Galileo's notion that nature is written in the language of mathematics, and if we understand this language of mathematics, then we can somehow tap into truth. And of course, mathematics is abstract. It is not contextual. It is absolute. It is unchanging. It is eternal. Through Eco's wonderful little book called The Search for the Perfect Language, Richard Rorty in the 1970s was among the earliest to criticize the possibility of a final language, but it continues to be present in the belief that science will somehow articulate and formulate a theory of everything. I must go back and point out one exception to this process, and that is as far back as Aristotle. Aristotle warned us that there are two types of knowledge. There is knowledge that is deductive, that you can formulate universal and context-less absolute laws from which you can deduce and predict future phenomenon. And that kind of knowledge he calls episteme, and it is in fact deductive. But Aristotle warns us there are other phenomena, and in particular he points out things having to do with human beings, like law, like medicine, for example, where you cannot dismiss the contextual, the local, the particular. You cannot dismiss time and the role of time in the process itself, and therefore in our understanding of it. And Aristotle warns us that for that we require a kind of knowledge or appreciation of the contextual that is called phronesis, practical wisdom. It has nothing to do with scientia, which is more in the episteme line, but nonetheless it's equally valid and equally legitimate. And it must take into account as the occasion, as the particular situation or context requires. That, however, got lost. Once Descartes in 1600s and Newton's universal gravitational equation seemed to explain almost everything, that notion that there is a kind of explanation, a logic of explanation that does take time and context seriously, completely gets lost in both philosophy and science. The problem gets complicated with the appearance of Hume, because Hume truly believed that the one method, again, the one taproot method for obtaining truth is sensory data. And what he says to himself is, look, if I rely exclusively on my perception, I never perceive either the efficacious part of cause in operation or its necessity. All I am ever able to perceive is event A regularly followed by event B. And what happens is that in my mind, those two become associated, and I therefore call A the cause of B. What Hume thereby does is he reduces causation to lawful regularities, and by doing so removes it from the sphere of ontology and relegates it, if you will, to the sphere of epistemology. But what it does is it beautifully allows philosophy and science to dovetail by making causal relationships simply the necessary and sufficient conditions of that are articulated in a law of nature. And so explanation, beginning with Hume, becomes equivalent to logical derivation. It becomes equivalent to a syllogistic argument where, again, a law of nature appears as the first premise, initial conditions appear as your second premise, and explanation and prediction become synonymous. If you can't predict, you haven't explained. One caveat is that this lawful regularity must be able to support counterfactuals. By that, philosophers mean what would have happened if this were the case must be handled by that lawful regularity. It cannot just be coincidental correlation. So this understanding of explanation as derivation is articulated most clearly in 1948 by Carl Hempel and Paul Oppenheim in their magnum opus called that article called The Studies in the Logic of Explanation, where they claim that explanation is argumentation and that an explanation is tantamount to prediction and not only allows us to predict, but it therefore allows us to retrodict, to look back into the past and see where it all came from. I strongly recommend Wesley Salmon's Locus Classicus, his 4 decades of scientific explanation, where he describes the impact of this article by Hempel and Oppenheim, as well as the way it fell apart over a period of 40 or some odd years. I remind you of the assumptions implied in the understanding of explanation as inference or explanation as derivation, and that is, no explanation can allow ceteris paribus clauses, because since the lawful regularity that is used as the major premise in such a notion of explanation is universal, you cannot have, well, all things being equal, this is what's going to happen. So that all particularities, all contextual nuances get removed and dismissed as irrelevant. In the case of deduction, since you can retrodict, there is no arrow of time. Therefore, no multiple realizability is possible, because it has to be a strict one-to-one determinism given A, B inexorably and necessarily will follow. There is therefore no probabilistic or statistical laws. Hempel particularly modified his view to try to incorporate a deductive statistical model of explanation and an inductive statistical model of explanation. But later on, he concluded that those are merely what we use when we really don't have all the details of the law precisely worked out. They are simply stopgap quasi-explanations that reflect our ignorance, not an objective possibility of indeterminism or objective possibility that nature might be probabilistic or stochastic. And finally, there is clearly no notion of the relationship between parts and wholes or parts. So there's no possible way to explain the qualitatively novel emergence of a systemic set of properties and wholeness or coherence or cohesiveness from the interactions of from independent but interrelated and connected parts. That simply, those kinds of relations, according to this received view of explanation as derivation, are simply impossible. And therefore, you find that biology and the notion of speciation and emergence and wholeness and systems theory, all of these cannot be accounted for by the standard received view of derivation, and that's where matters stood pretty much only about 25, 30 years ago. The second part of this talk will discuss how that model came apart. I just want to point out that what there is in common to all of it is the dismissal of what I'm calling adventitious roots, and that is the dismissal of the particular, the contextual, the temporal, the unique, the singular, and therefore the dismissal of anything having to do with praxis or cultures or traditions or history. So that the point I've tried to make in these last few minutes with this presentation is that although the form of explanation changes from mythology to science, from an explicit genealogy of the hero, of the city, of the authority of the storyteller, nonetheless, the notion that you explain the temporal and the apparent and the phenomenal by showing how it can be derived from the eternal, unchanging, universal, and non-phenomenal, continues unabated from the time of mythology to the views of natural science. And I think it's not until complexity theory and our understanding of sensitivity to initial conditions and nonlinear, the ability to model and picture and simulate nonlinear dynamical phenomena that we have begun to break this mold of explanation means tapping into the divine in the sense of eternal, unchanging, universal, and so on. Thank you.